first speaker is Saliso Tipanyani, who, as a human rights specialist, was the former director of the South African Human Rights Commission. He has spoken at roundtables a number of times, and you'll find his presentation exceptional. Then we have Tamara Al-Rifai with Human Rights Watch, North African Advocacy Director, coordinator, something like that. In the center, we have Milton Al-Amadi, who's the publisher of Black Star News and a professor who teaches guerrilla journalism, and an author. Sitting next to him, we have Danny Schechter, who's a longtime film, TV journalist, writes the News Dissector, a media channel, and when I met him, he was producing a show called South Africa Now, very involved in the anti-apartheid movement, has many films to his credit. I don't know if he brought any with him, but you can ask about him. And then, all the way on the right to the table, we have a speaker who's just actually been added to the program. His name is Osama Abdel Khalek, and he's going to speak about Egypt from personal experience.
And clearly, from my own perspective, I think President Morsi and the Islamic Brotherhood made a couple of mistakes. One, this is a transition. You are in a country which has not had democracy for a long time, and therefore you need to be very sensitive in how you move forward, especially when you have a very slim majority of 52%. And then, secondly, I think what should have really have happened in Egypt, like in my own country, there should really have been a much more of a government of national unity, because of the warring faction, the different factions, in order to stabilize the country before you get into real issues. And that did not happen. And then thirdly, the constitution which was adopted by President Morsi and the Islamic Brotherhood was not fully accepted by the Egyptian people. And it had a number of difficulties in it. So for example, if you look at the Egyptian constitution, the only way in which you could remove the president outside elections is through an impeachment, which requires 2/3 majority. In other constitutions, like my own country, that you can also remove a president by a vote of no confidence and being removed by a simple majority, and the president should resign. So in this case, when there was unhappiness over President Morsi's style of governance, as well as increasing intolerance to other areas, and basically the whole issue of pluralism, my sense is that Egyptian people who were behind the revolution basically got frustrated and probably realized that they cannot wait for the next elections to deal with this man. And that's why there was a massive protest in the country before his removal.
Now, let's take a close shot at where Egypt is today, because this is what Human Rights Watch is now focusing on. We have these massive protests that have started in support of the ousted President Mohamed Morsi. And facing them, we have an interim government that has authorized, and I quote, the use of all necessary means to disperse the protest. The government has therefore mandated the security forces to, and between brackets, and I do acknowledge the presence of an Egyptian diplomat, but the government has mandated security forces that are not very known for their human rights record, and that have at times used excessive force to disperse demonstrations, at least I'm talking about over the past 3 years. The government has mandated them with dispersing the protesters. Not good. In addition, Egypt's Ministry of Interior rules are generally overbroad, and they generally allow the police to use firearms in ways that are that go beyond the international standards, namely the UN standards. Not good. So, meanwhile, in the background, diplomatically, the AU very promptly suspended Egypt's membership in the Union. And as we speak, you probably all know that there is a high-level AU delegation visiting Egypt this week until the 7th of August, and it has already met with the interim president, Adli Mansour, with the vice president, Mohammed Baradei, with the Minister of Defense, General Sisi, and more importantly for us at Human Rights Watch, with the Minister of Transitional Justice and National Reconciliation.
What we see right now is the human rights abuse, which obviously concerns all of us, and we all feel for Egypt. With a huge population of over 85 million, a very important country. Of course, it's in Africa, for anybody that doubts that.
There's civilization media.
But I think maybe there are 2 or 3 points that I could focus on. And first of all, it's the role of the United States. When the US, for example, initially said it was caught off guard or surprised by developments in Egypt, only a nursery school child could believe that fairy tale. Because as we now well know, the United States actually probably knows more about the workings of the Egyptian military than General al-Sisi himself, probably knows more about the Muslim Brotherhood than President Morsi himself, and probably knows more about all the opposition parties than the opposition party leaders.
That's right.
And how do we know that for a fact? We know that because Ed Snowden told us that. Because if we are talking about eventually the solution in Egypt, bringing all the parties together, how are you going to bring all the parties together when it's clearly obvious that the sole superpower and the corporate media are already aligned on one side? And that to me is a part of the problem. So it's not only a domestic Egyptian crisis, it's a crisis whose major players also happen to be outside Egypt.
Analyze it over the years, and you'll notice there's one missing factor in all of the coverage, and that is something that we journalists basically consider ourselves driven to explore, which is follow the money. And you'll notice that the economy of Egypt, that the internationalization of that economy, the $3 billion that Egypt received every year, with Israel receiving a similar amount, which went into the building of the Egyptian army, has not been mentioned very much in the press at all. And in fact, the nature of the Egyptian military. The Egyptian military is not just a military. It's a military-industrial complex based very much on our own military-industrial complex. The Egyptian military runs massive industries. It has a stake in keeping a certain status quo going, and not only bringing in money, but making money on all of these enterprises. Also, the other side of this, of course, is that there's been no coverage of the labor movement in Egypt, of the strikes that have been taking place and are taking place now, which was a big factor in the original uprising. You would think that the entire Tahrir Square enterprise was simply a production of Al Jazeera or CNN, or a production of Facebook on some level. You know, when in fact this was a reflection of much deeper forces in Egyptian society, which got no coverage at all.
I'd like to say that I have a reservation towards the comment and the issue, the question whether Egypt is even African or not. So Egypt is African. This is a given. This is a constant. It is not a variable. Egypt is too African. I can give you 100 examples of how Egypt is too African. You can look at the temples where you'll see the cows where you can watch in Uganda and in Nigeria. You can speak about the FGM, how it is too African in Egypt. We don't have it in the Arab world, for instance, and so on and so forth. those younger, brave Egyptian, brave-hearted younger Egyptians, they went into the street exactly for the same reason, asking for a better human rights, better security forces, better so on and so forth. So I couldn't agree more. Yes, we are asking and calling for accountability. Yet it is a work in progress. You know, a country with the size of mine, with 88 million people, with having a dictator for 30 years, speaking about Mubarak, cannot shift into being a full democracy in a couple of years. We cannot be as Britain in the records of human rights in 5 years' time. Believe me, it will take us longer to do so. But to show that at least we are on the right direction, we have Mubarak being tried. Mubarak is facing charges. Mubarak is behind bars. For God's sake, you need to realize that we are putting our Pharaoh, you know, we had that pharaonic heritage. We used to put our president in such a high niche, you know, they had all powers and so on. It's a mix of history and religion and so on. So now we have our last Pharaoh is behind bars, is being tried. It shows that we are on the right direction.